It has been a year and a half since we first made the submission for this panel, and yeah, Nadine is smiling. I think we all hopefully developed a little bit in that time. And that's also why the title of my presentation has changed a little bit in the meantime. And we're speaking about the idea of oceanic history and its conceptual implications for modern Japan. So this is going to be a bit of an experiment of thought that starts with the following problem. Pacific islands, such as Japan, are often unduly represented as isolated places. And I think that's a problem, since land-centric biases obscure the ocean's significance as an ecological connector and a catalyst of historical change. Scholars in the tradition of Fernand Braudel have written about the importance of the East Asian Mediterranean with the sea as a regional or global connector between land-based commercial and political centers. Now, unfortunately, such classical conceptions of maritime history regard the sea as a mere piece of transportation infrastructure or as a narrow littoral zone of maritime economy. However, at the time of global environmental change, historians grow increasingly aware of the significance of human, non-human interactions and environmental change as sources of cultural, economic, and political change, right? Ecosystems become seen as objects of competition or as mediators of environmental change that again create political tension. From an ecological point of view, the oceans, which cover some 71% of the globe's surface, represent a large part of the global ecosystem. In the case of Japan's claimed maritime jurisdiction, which you can see on this slide here, we are looking at 12 times the nation state's land surface that Japan claims as its sovereign space. How come then our historical understanding of the sea is still so superficial? In recent years, an environmental turn has enabled new views of the ocean, new ways of looking at the ocean as a source of historical change, while the firm modernist belief in the planned engineerability of mechanical environment crumbles in the view of the environmental transformations that we are witnessing today. And this has inspired the famous philosopher Bruno Latour to state that the Earth has now taken back all the characteristics of a full-fledged actor. So we have to begin this whole journey with a new idea of basically agency that encompasses human and non-human factors of historical change. Jeffrey Bolster, Carmel Finley, and others have pointed out that terra-centric biases lead fisheries managers, as much as historians, to apply an agrarian logic to the relationship of harvest and replenishment in the sea. However, the ocean requires a methodology that pays close attention to the actual workings of such oceanic ecosystems, which are distinct from grasslands, forests, or deserts, and yet affected by the same ideological precepts that inform human action. So what would it mean then if we were to incorporate the ocean proper into our picture of modern Japanese history? As a first conceptual intervention, I suggest that we speak of Japan not as a group of islands that are confined to a limited terrestrial realm, but as an archipelago, an amphibious economy, awash in the abundant currents of the North Pacific. With its commercialized markets and some of the largest cities in the early modern world already, the archipelago has long been dependent on the ocean as a supplier of food, but also fertilizing materials and non-perishable produce, such as whale strings or baleen. Baleen is what you can see here in this picture, basically what some whale species have instead of teeth, and that's quite useful to produce various tools of everyday use, such as combs. The way in which these industries developed from coastal fisheries into resource imperialism at a global scale already in 1930 and continued into the 21st century, this reveals that the ocean has a geography of its own within which human interests evolve and conflict historically. To give you an example of what I mean with that, let me show you this map, which I designed in the attempt to do exactly this, centering the ocean and evidencing or visualizing some of the most prominent features of its internal geography. as they mattered for Japan in the 19th century. You notice that we're here turning the world upside down. So south is at the top of this map. You have the Japanese islands here, the Eurasian continent, and the Philippines in the upper right corner. This red ribbon here represents the warm and nutrient-rich Kuroshio Current as it turns north along the Philippines towards Taiwan, enters the South China Sea, a shallow zone where then nutrients come close to the surface and attract lots of fish and whales. And then it splits into the Tsushima Current that goes through the Tsushima Strait into the Japan Sea, and the other branch meanders along the southern shores of the Japanese main islands, where incidentally we find some of the most prolific, again, whaling zones of the early modern world. East of Honshu, the warm Kuroshio Current meets with the cold Oyashio Current, which is again a very nutrient-rich current, and it forms the Kuroshio Extension, or also Kuroshio Confluence Zone, which attracted whalers since the early 19th century. This zone is also known as the Japan Ground in the English language from works such as Herman Melville's Moby Dick. In fact, decades before the establishment of formal relations between Japan and Western governments, British, American, and Japanese businesses were fishing out of the same pond, especially in this Kuroshio Extension zone. And this fact had a profound impact on the way Japan oriented itself in the geopolitical environment of the early modern Pacific, the modern Pacific. Now, to get a clearer picture of this process, I georeferenced some 660,000 ship positions from the American offshore whaling logbook database and got the following picture just to show you how this evolved spatially. Since the 1820s, the whale ground in the Kuroshio Extension here was the target of American whaling voyages, and they increased in number in the 1830s. But what this map does not include is the British ships that were actually a little bit ahead of the wave at the time, and by 1820 already sailed very close to Japan, and in several instances also went on shore, and that caused concern among Japanese leaders. The most famous response to repeated interaction with Westerners on and off the shores of Japan was the issue of the so-called "Don't Think Twice," or also "Shall Repel" edict of 1825, that tried to effectively enforce the seclusion policy. Over the 1830s and 40s, as you can see, the number of whalers kept growing, and by the 1840s, American whalers were literally all around Japan, also whaling in the Sea of Japan, around the Ryukyu Islands, around the Bonin Islands, Ogasawara Islands, and northeast of Japan. So a lot of traffic is going on, and noticeably they did sail within view from the land, especially in the Tsushima Strait and the Tsugaru Strait, and unsurprisingly, dozens of encounters on and offshore are recorded for these regions within Japan. Whereas the Japanese core lands were apparently actively avoided by the whalers, perhaps because the seclusion policies would have been enforced with more rigor near the capital. This trend inverted around 1850, as you can see in the fourth picture, that's shortly before the arrival of Parry's black ships, when whale stocks had already declined so much that this shrinking American whaling fleet began to migrate north to the still abundant whaling grounds of the Sea of Okhotsk. So in a way, you see the whaling frontier move towards Japan, over Japan, and then up to the last frontiers before then in the 1860s and 70s, it ultimately collapsed and American whaling almost disappeared. In reality, it retracted to the Atlantic, but it did collapse. Nevertheless, the Pacific, the open sea, has become a site of geopolitical confrontation and of resource competition, and the Tokugawa shogunate did no longer want to miss out on this competition. The subsequent race for naval technology that happened to significant part out on the open ocean or on a maritime middle ground, such as the Bonin Islands, which I mentioned before, was in that sense an early flagship project of modernization under the Tokugawa shogunate. It involved the reverse engineering of a stranded Russian schooner and the hire of retired whalers that had settled in the Bonin Islands, and that then acted as actor of maritime knowledge. They put their practical knowledge into the service of the Japanese. And here on this slide, you can see a depiction of one of these first Volin voyages under the Tokugawa shogunate near the Bonin Islands. And in the bottom, a photograph of some Bonin Islanders that were, as I said, mostly retired whalers that then went into Japanese services. So studying the Pacific as an economic space and studying the way Japan vied for influence within it brings strategic sides, subaltern actors, and political tensions to the fore that may otherwise seem peripheral. Over the late 19th century, entrepreneurs and governments of Japan embarked on an expansionist strategy of setting up resource colonies on the islands that sprinkled across the southern sea of Japan. And you can see them here highlighted on my map. Looked at in isolation, they may all appear as peripheral or insignificant small places. But if looked at as a connected maritime space that went through this process of colonization, then we start seeing that the expansion of Japan's modern pelagic empire was in reality starting with island hopping in the near Pacific. Based on the Kuroshio Current, the most significant ecological engine in this region, I call this zone the Kuroshio Frontier. As the arrival and disappearance of Atlantic whalers in the Kuroshio extension in the 1830s, or the later mushrooming of short-lived bird hunting colonies on these islands shows, resource extraction proceeds in a layered manner. And these layers are being worked through one by one as a result of unsustainable practices offshore that rely on the continued expansion and technological innovation that enables the continued opening of new frontiers. So we're looking at a shift from resource to resource ever deeper under the surface. And today, obviously, this is continuing and the vertical component of this development gains significance as rare earth minerals, methane ice, and other resources attract the interest of governments and corporations that join forces in their exploration. Japan is working to gain acknowledgement of an extended continental shelf, which is highlighted in purple here on the map, in regions that promise rich deposits in such resources. With whale and fish populations reduced to a fraction of pre-industrial levels, oceanic industries are now shifting towards inanimate resources. Japan's oceanic expansion that continues into the present bridges conventional divides of early modern and modern, shogunal and imperial, but also insular and global. It raises crucial questions about ecology and sustainability, and it can bring new ecological backgrounds and connections to the fore. And this is what I think is the real contribution of an oceanic focus in modern Japanese history. So what is the archipelago's footprint, ecological footprint really, and what has it been historically? What fueled the empire's expansion ideologically, financially, but also in terms of energy resources? What may maritime territorialization mean in the 21st century? And what are the limitations of static, terracentric ideas of sovereignty, but also of oceanic ecologies when it comes to trying to understand a pelagic empire, formal or informal? And I think Nadine will be speaking to this question as well. So these are just a few of the many questions an oceanic focus can bring to Japanese history. And of course, you have noticed already that by just raising all of these ambitious questions, which I can impossibly answer in 15 minutes, I'm actually just shamelessly taking advantage of this panel to propagate my newest publication, which will appear next month, or hopefully in the next few weeks, in the Journal of Pacific History. And if I got you a little bit interested with this talk, then please check it out and do let me know what you think about it. And let me conclude my contribution with this.